All right, everybody, I'd like to welcome you to our April edition of the 2013-2014 Lake States Fire Science Consortium webinar series. I'm Jack McGowan-Stinsky, and I serve as the program manager for the consortium. I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and are one of 14 regional consortia across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and adoption of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners, organizations, and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. During the webinar, if you'd like to ask a question or interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of the screen. Once you type your question, just click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions. We'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them. Second, if you want to get the full view, you can maximize your webinar window on your computer. Just be aware that you won't be able to see the chat box when you do that. If you'd like to learn more about the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website. You can look for information at www.lakestatesfiresci.net. Please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of other activities. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Now to today's webinar. I would like to introduce Rob Rempel. Rob is a research scientist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and is located at the Centre for Northern Forest Ecosystem Research in Thunder Bay, Ontario. He is an adjunct professor in the Department of Biology and in the Faculty of Natural Resource Management at Lakehead University. Rob leads the Spatial Ecology program and has been working on both development and evaluation of forest management guides for the Boreal and Great Lakes St. Lawrence Landhaven of Ontario. Rob works on modeling both moose and songbird habitat and uses forests arising from natural disturbance as the key reference condition for his studies. With that, I'd like to welcome Rob and turn control of the webinar over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Jack. And first I'd like to thank you and Don Marsh and Greg Course for the invites and also for some very interesting discussions that we've had over the last several months over email. I got a picture of myself up there, but I was going to also put a picture up of the center here on Lakehead University campus so you could see the snowstorm we're having today. And I'm looking outside at a huge snow dump, and it's quite a lot different and quite far away from the fire conditions and the fire season, and hardly difficult to think about it actually occurring this year. But in any case, spring will eventually come, and but I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you today. So my talk today is going to cover a number of topics, but the general theme is the integration of policy and science as it applies to incorporating principles of natural disturbance into forest conservation and management. So I'll touch a bit about the policy and legislative context, discuss a little bit about the adaptive management framework that the guides are, the development of the guides are cast in, and then go on to discussing a bit about the methods of how we estimated the range of natural variability for use in these forest management guides. And I'll talk about applying the guides in forest management, how this information is actually used. And then finally, I'll discuss a bit on looking at guide effectiveness monitoring, where we are essentially treating this emulation of natural disturbance policy as hypothesis. So first of all, I have a slide up of some pertinent words that come out of the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. So the Crown Forest Sustainability Act is the act that basically enables the development or requires the development of the forest management guides and gives the direction that those guides should follow. And so this is about sustaining long-term health and ecosystems and ecosystem services, if you will. And those principles, are based on. This is very important on maintaining ecological processes and biodiversity, or the conservation of ecological processes and biodiversity. But in addition to requiring that, it also discusses how that should be done. And it directs us to emulate natural disturbance and landscape patterns while minimizing adverse effects on plants and water and soil, etc. So, if you put all of that sort of into a nutshell, the Crown Forest Sustainability Act tells us to maintain eco-services by conserving biodiversity and ecological processes. That's a long way, basically, of saying ecological integrity, and to do this through the emulation of natural disturbances, but within limits. And so I guess that sometimes there's a lot of discussion about the term within limits and what does that mean, at least locally here. And so, for example, if emulating natural disturbance would result in the elevation of mercury levels in water beyond those that are acceptable within other Clean Water Acts within the province, then we wouldn't be able to do that. If we did certain things that would violate the Migratory Bird Act, which is a binational act, and that takes precedence over, because it's binational, then we wouldn't be able to do that. So there's certain limits. Some of those are legal limits, and others just make a lot of sense, that we wouldn't want to emulate the full range of natural disturbance, but we want to use principles of natural disturbance as our tool, if you will, to conserve biodiversity and ecological processes. So I think it's kind of important, and this figure of guide evolution. It's like policy evolution, and it's occurred right across North America, where we basically going from things like maximum sustained yield. We had guides for that, and then down into featured species management, and then over time we developed in the 90s natural disturbance emulation guides, and some specific guides for martin and pileated woodpecker, and now we're at the point of landscape and stand and our new landscape and stand and site guides. And if we look at the sort of the axis, and I've stolen this kind of type of figure from engineers, it's used in project development, and it's called a cone of uncertainty. But if we look at this, we look at the axis on the y-axis as being ecological uncertainty, and there's being two major components. One is risk to biodiversity, and the other is knowledge uncertainty. Then the idea of guide evolution is to kind of, as we move along and we conduct scientific studies, and we incorporate scientific information into these guides, that we're reducing risk to biodiversity, and we're reducing knowledge uncertainty, and we're getting closer and closer as time goes on to achieving our objective, which is sustaining these ecosystems, but doing it in a sound manner that reduces risk to biodiversity, and that we have better knowledge and better confidence in the kind of rules and kind of approaches that we're taking. So, as you can imagine, those are words associated with adaptive management, and the development of guides is really cast in this sort of adaptive management framework. So the development of the guide is driven in there's a large part of it is driven by the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. And then we have implementation, and we have a number of tools that we've used in terms of implementation. We monitor the effectiveness and then evaluate the guides. Now, one of the things which is relatively new in Ontario, probably less than 10 years old, is that we are now required by law to evaluate the effectiveness of forest management guides. And also, we are required by law to take that information from forest management or forest guide effectiveness monitoring every 5 years and consider that in revision and review and revision of the guides. So, I think one of the problems that often happen in adaptive management is you get to the point of monitoring and evaluation, but there's never a sort of a close of the feedback loop to a requirement to revise your initial policy. And one of the things that makes me a bit excited here, or at least interested in this particular project, is the fact that that your results are going to have to be at least looked at. It doesn't mean they're going to use them, but they've got to at least consider them in the evaluation of policy and new revisions to the guides. So what are these guides? And there's two, and I'm going to focus here mainly on the landscape guide. There's also the stand and site guides, but in a nutshell, the landscape guides direct the amount of the amount of different forest types that should be on the landscape, and also the pattern of those landscapes. And this direction is based on estimates of natural variation. Okay, so what we're trying to do is bring our forest back into kind of a state that we would expect under natural disturbance, sort of before a heavy influence of people on the landscape. So how do we get this estimate of natural variation? Well, I think it's important to realize, and I really always have to sort of begin, when I talk about estimating natural range of variation, that the past 100 years is simply one instance of what the forest could have looked like as a result of natural variation. It's a result of a specific set of initial conditions and a specific set of climatic conditions and weather conditions during that period. So if we want to, talk about the future, and we want to say, well, what should we expect, in terms of natural variation, we need something a little bit more than just looking at one instance of natural variation, and that's where we have used simulation, forest fire simulation, and succession, models of succession to help us estimate what we should expect and the range of variation that we should expect under a natural disturbance regime. And this natural disturbance regime includes low, medium, and high intensity fire regimes. So we sort of simulate across a range of intensities. And so some of the inputs to that include things like an understanding of landscape dynamics, of fire processes, and succession, and also some understanding of what our soil layers are, and the moisture conditions, and existing forest cover and whatnot, which might moderate or change the behavior of fire. As well as the model mechanics, the mechanics both of the fire simulation as well as the succession rules. But having simulated fire, in a sense, you really need to have a check to see whether or not it's really within the scope of reality. And this is where we used pre-industrial condition, and this is based on survey records that were conducted in this area over 100 years ago. And these survey records provide some really good details. I know that, I believe that similar kinds of surveys have been used in Minnesota in the past to look at natural variation. And they're used as kind of a check and a feedback to see whether or not our models are operating within the realm of expectation. And so from there we go on to finally, accepting a reasonable or plausible estimate of the simulated range of natural variation. So it's important that we use the word simulated range because we're not talking about just one instance of natural range, but it's really a simulated range of natural variation. So on this slide here, we can see this conceptualization of a fire burning across the landscape in the simulated manner. The landscapes that you see here, those sort of circles, that is ecoregion 3W, which surrounds Lake Nipigon, which is north of Lake Superior. And this is just some examples. This is about 15 of 60 replicates here of different results of the simulation. The lower the intensity of the disturbance on the landscape, it's a brown. The higher the intensity, it's green in this particular case. And so we can account for both the amount but also the pattern. And I'll explain this again later on in a further slide, but if you can imagine that we lay a 500 hectare grid over top of each of these burns, and we look at, in this case, we're looking at the amount of mature and old forest that's left on the landscape after the burn. I guess in this case, the green means that if you were to look inside that cell, you would find lots, almost completely full of mature forest. But if it's almost all brown, then it would be, virtually, devoid of mature forest. And that is a kind of a texture of it's a quantification of the texture of the landscape. And in this particular case, you see a kind of a U-shaped distribution. And again, I'll talk about that later. But also you see error bars. And these error bars in this case represent the range between the 25th and 75th percentile for all the different simulations that we looked at. So that's, kind of a bit of a glimpse at the idea of how we calculated the simulated range of natural variation. Okay, so now, just talking a bit about how do we apply, we've got this science, and you can imagine the guides have been developed, so how do we begin to apply these guides in forest management planning? Well, this arrow out of the way, I think. First of all, we need to measure what the current state of the forest are. And we use something that's called prescriptive indicators, and these are indicators that relate to things like various landscape classes, mature forest, young forest. And the reason they're called prescriptive indicators is because we can use them in management to prescribe things that we want done to the landscape. So once we've taken a look at where we are in the landscape, then we need to sort of estimate where, what are the desired levels where we want to be if we wanted to move the landscape closer to this range of natural variation. And we use this interquartile range rather than standard deviation for doing this. Then once we've got some idea there, then we think about some of the targets that we want. We may be under on one class or over on another class. We want to move the landscape closer to what we think is a natural pattern. And so we develop targets, for our forest management plans, that are based on direction provided in this landscape guide. And then sometimes there are, we need to identify individual large patches on the landscape. Maybe it's for caribou or maybe it's for marten, but that's kind of the final step that we would go through. So, as you can imagine, this is would be quite daunting. I mean, we've got all these simulations, we've got these complex, set of rules or of guidance, of how we want to change the landscape across multiple classes of forest, and and so it's a pretty tall order for planners, and without computer tools, I think this would be almost undoable. So one of the key parts of the project was the development of this Ontario's landscape tool, which is a planning tool that provides easy access to the science that went into the landscape guide, and is designed to calculate both prescriptive and evaluative indicators. I'll explain evaluative indicators in a bit. So this allows us to compare those indicators to the simulated range of natural variation on your forest, and it assembles all the relevant information for planners, in an easily accessible package so that they can make, good decisions and good guidance and incorporate this, fire science and ecological knowledge into the planning process. And so sort of mentioned before, the indicators can be calculated for both today's forests, but also for future forest maps that might be generated using some kind of a harvest scheduler. Anything from, there's Woodstock and Patchworks, and I'm not sure if Landis is one that generates future forests, under planning scenarios. I haven't used that one a lot. But you can imagine you've got different programs that let you lay out your cut blocks and then age the forest and into the future. So the prescriptive, and here if you look right around, bring this over here, see that we've got some prescriptive indicators, and there's 4 or 5 prescriptive indicators, and so when you run the model, it'll generate the calculate the values of prescriptive indicators for that particular forest and allow you to compare it against the simulations that were done using the fire simulation models, and allow you then to compare how close or how far you are away from where you want to be with respect to natural variability. So I'm going to go through some slides showing the calculation of some of the results from the simulated natural range of variation. But before I do, I just want to explain what the slides will look like. This box that you see here, the square box, that's the 25th to 75th percentile. And as you can imagine, when you simulate things with natural disturbance, it's a very non-normal distribution. It's very skewed. And so we basically needed to use a non-parametric analog, if you will, of a plus or minus 1 standard deviation. And this green dot down here towards the bottom, this is where the forest was, the condition of the forest at the time that the simulations were done, which was back in 2006, using current, the 2006 generation of our forest inventory maps. So that's where we were, and then there will also be in these other slides a blue box, which is a calculation of where we are in today's forest. So in this slide here, and you can get a little bit better idea of where the ecoregion 3W lies, just north of Lake Superior. Duluth is right down around here, and we're just up here. And so, so this is one of the forests within this ecoregion. And if you take a look at it, you can see that the boxes, this is for one of the prescriptive indicators called landscape class. It's a broad group of landscape classes. And for most of our those classes, or for some of those classes anyways, the condition of the current condition of the forest, which is this blue box, indicates that we are within the simulated range of natural variation. So we're good with that particular class. But this one here, which is some of the immature conifers, were below where we would expect to be, and the same with the mature late conifer dominant. We're a little below of where we'd want to be, and in this case here, with hardwood, we actually have more than we would expect under our simulation results. This is Jackpine and Jackpine dominant forest, and you can see that for all of these, we are, within the range of variation that we would expect. If our blue boxes were down here someplace below, especially for these immature classes, and if we had Kirtland's warbler in our area, then we might have some concern, especially if Kirtland's warbler was in decline, that we were underrepresenting, that particular class, and we might want to increase it as a way to get back, to bringing that species back. We don't have Kirtland's warbler, not to any degree, anyways, in this area. This one here is for hardwood dominated forests, and remember we're in the Boreal, and these, both at the start of the simulation in 2006, we were above where we thought we should be. In other words, there's more hardwood on the landscape than we would expect under a natural disturbance regime. But even a bit more troubling is that we are moving away. So these boxes are 2010, and we are actually getting more hardwood than. So this is where we would want to take action, to start to bring this blue box down, closer to where we should be, if we wanted to emulate, what we would, what kind of forest we would expect under a natural disturbance regime. So this last of the prescriptive indicators has to do with pattern. And this one's a little bit more complicated, and it's an attempt, or it is a method of quantifying spatial pattern. And if you look at the box, or this landscape on the left, these are dispersed block cuts of about 200 hectares each that occurred as a result of applying the moose habitat guides. These are forest management guides, the forest management guides that preceded the landscape guides, and it required this high level of interspersion of young and old age class and small block cuts. And over here, we have a landscape where we have a natural burn, this one that's kind of a pinkish color, and then on the left, hopefully you can see that, is a result of a progressive clear cut that's meant to emulate the pattern that we would expect under natural disturbance. So, if we look at the, if you're to overlay a grid on here and to say, okay, how many, and a grid of say 500 hectare cells, and a lot of those cells would be completely filled with mature forest, or they would be completely filled with young forest. And you end up with a kind of a U-shaped distribution, which what these green bars describe, that's the simulated range of natural variation. But if you go over here where the moose guides are applied and you overlaid such a grid, what you would end up with is about most of the cells with around 50% of disturbance and 50% mature, and you would have more of a kind of a bell-shaped kind of distribution, on this histogram. So this histogram kind of provides a way of quantifying texture on the landscape, and its objective is to move you from this kind of very fragmented landscape into more aggregated, less fragmented landscape, which is more characteristic of natural disturbance. The gray on this histogram here is where we currently are with the forest. So it's not quite a bell-shaped, but you can see that we're a long ways off from the kind of spatial pattern or texture on the landscape that we'd want to have under under the emulation of natural disturbance. So the idea here is that we have prescriptive indicators that are moving us towards both the relative amounts of different forest classes and the spatial pattern of these forest classes, and and get us closer to what we'd expect with a natural disturbance regime. So this next slide is an evaluative indicator. So it's not a prescription that we use to get us anywhere, but it's to say, what does the wildlife tell us about how good a job we're doing in terms of emulating natural disturbance? And so we developed, we've selected species, and I'll go through that in the next set of slides, and developed spatially explicit resource selection functions and applied those to the simulated landscapes. And that gives us an estimate of how frequently we should expect these birds on the landscape, or probability of occupancy. Another way of saying that is the proportion of area occupied by these species. And we can see that for many of these species, the occupancy rate is is right within what we would expect under a natural forest. But for some species, and this one here is bait-breasted warbler, you can see that we've undershot, what we expect to have, and this probably relate to the forest classes. Like we'd undershot, what we'd expect on in terms of some of the older conifer classes. So this slide here is from the landscape guide, and it shows some of the direction for both a short, medium, and long-term direction. So, for example, this upland pine and spruce forest, we can see that the direction, and this is for the Lake Nipigon forest, which is on the east side of Lake Nipigon. We need to increase over the short and medium term the amount of forest we have in upland pine and spruce forest. But also, we'll just go up here and look at mature and late, oh, no, I'm looking at this one here. Mature and late hardwood and hardwood mixed wood, and we actually want to decrease those amounts. And you saw, from those figures that we had either overshot or undershot for those classes. And so this is specific direction then that's given to forest planners, for the short and medium term. And remember, these guides will be updated or revised on 5-year cycles, so some of this direction then would get changed as we move, from one period to the next. All right, so all of this is, fine and good, and but the question, is does it really work? you know. So, you know, are we actually, you know, is the emulation of natural disturbance actually working in terms of our ecological conservation objectives? And there's two kind of key things here when we want to look at whether or not these guides are working in terms of these objectives. First of all, our landscape, our prescriptive indicators changing as a result of the landscape guide. And just so put a little bit of time context, the Boreal guides just got accepted about a month ago, so we're just at the beginning of these stages. So although you see, you know, that we've been off on a lot of those prescriptive indicators, that really defines where we are starting right now, and these guides are now going to come in force, and so people are going to have to start moving, trying to move their forests closer to where we want them to be. And then the second thing is our focal species, our evaluative indicators, responding to the change in the way that we would expect, you know, under a natural disturbance regime. So this is this kind of notion of treating guide effectiveness monitoring as a hypothesis. So, you know, we're essentially treating the emulation of natural disturbance as a hypothesis where the major expected outcome is conservation of ecological integrity. But this is, you know, a higher and more complex objective than the forest management guides for the provision of moose habitat, as we are linking the conservation of ecological processes to conservation of biodiversity. So not only, you know, as society is asking for more complex and more sophisticated approach to how we manage our forests, and so, you know, we have to develop guides that don't just look at maximum yield anymore, but, you know, are keeping moose on the landscape, but now we're talking about keeping all of biodiversity on the landscape, and on top of that, keeping the ecological processes, you know, working. But, you know, we also now are looking at, at maintaining ecological integrity. So a monitoring program has to be able to respond to this. So I'm going to go through a little bit about the ecological process, one of the major ones, which is the natural disturbance process, and how that is linked to the selection of the particular focal species that we used as kind of a bioassay, if you will, for testing whether or not we're maintaining ecological or integrity, at least testing that hypothesis. So this is kind of Halling's symbol here, and it's the notion that forests begin. You know, from one starting point, we have early successional species that are exploiting nutrients that have been made recently available. These may be shade intolerant species, and then over time we move towards more shade tolerant and higher conservation, a K-adapted ecosystem. Eventually that's released you know, through fire or some sort of disturbance process, and then we have a reorganization of these patterns into something different as a result of that disturbance. So, you know, this sort of cycle of disturbance in the boreal forest results in habitat variability, where we have species that are adapted to this. So this disturbance process is creating a large range and variability of forest structure across the landscape, and it's providing opportunities for species and which have adapted to different, you know, stages within that cycle. So, you know, if we think of this in this heuristic model, we have a disturbance process where we can have intensity of disturbance ranging from high to low, frequency from, you know, frequent disturbances or seldom, and the extent of disturbance. They can be large disturbance with very homogeneous, or small disturbances, a bunch of skips and jumps or dispersed block cuts, you know, that sort of thing. And this is true for both the managed and the natural. And then this results in forest composition, you know, hardwood dominated versus softwood, you know, structure, more, you know, multi-layered stands, or, you know, very simple stands, and patterns across the landscape, you know, homogeneous or high levels of interspersion. So if you think of it from a wildlife perspective, we can find species that are adapted to each corner of the box, if you will. And so this forest condition translates into wildlife habitat But the objective of forest management then is that we don't want to shrink the box in terms of variability and condition of the forest, but we're going to use wildlife to tell us when we have begun to shrink the box. And I'll use Kirtland's warbler again. Let's say you needed large expanses of young conifer forest, which would be this corner of the box down here. Well, if all of a sudden you start seeing Kirtland's warbler going down, well, chances are you've changed the structure of the landscape, so it's no longer reflected the landscape that Kirtland's warbler is adapted to, and you need to look at, restoring that variability back. So that box I just described is a very good heuristic, but the actual work of selecting which species we want to use involves a suite of statistical tools, things like multivariate analysis, canonical correspondence analysis. We associate, for example, the age of the forest with different species, brown creeper, being shading older forest. This sort of threshold analysis here is with generalized additive models, and we see brown creeper dropping dramatically as the amount of age class interspersion increases, but common yellow throat increasing. And also from and these are generalized additive models overlaid on the CCA ordination. So again, these are things that help us sort of populate this box, if you will, and say, okay, which species should we select, which represent kind of this range of variability. And we're sort of more interested in taking species around the edges of this kind of canonical variation than, let's say, species right in the center, which are less demanding. So this is the suite of species that we've selected, and I won't go on about it too much, other than it represents quite a range and variability on the landscape. And these are the focal species for which in the forest management plans we use indicators. So getting back to our effectiveness monitoring questions. Now that we've got a set of focal species that we believe are related to the natural disturbance process and are indicators and sort of a kind of a surrogate umbrella community, if you will, of the range of natural variation, we can ask questions like, is occupancy lower in reference sites compared to forest management sites? Is occupancy rate lower than the simulated range of natural variation than our expectation? And also, is occupancy rate declining over time? So those are three principal questions that I've been asking in our songbird work related to the guide management. But I just want to point out, when you do things like treat policy as hypothesis, it's important to isolate components of variance or to isolate effects. So imagine in a situation where you are monitoring and you have a situation where bird population is increasing in abundance in the reference area, let's say burns and parks, but is actually decreasing in harvested areas. But if you sum the two, you get an average which shows that there is no change. So you really can't, no control, no conclusion is one of the expressions that Tom Nudd sometimes makes, and this is the example that I'm using here to show that why we need to have a reference site. Likewise, we may find a situation where both in the reference condition and in the treatment, there's no difference between the two, and they're both declining over time. And in this case, there is no indication that forest management is the cause of the decline. We don't know what the cause of the decline is in this case. It could be climate change, or it could be degradation of habitat in the overwintering grounds. But if we didn't have a reference and a treatment for monitoring, we would not be able to make that distinction, and we would only be able to conclude that forest management was the cause. So here are some initial results, and in this particular slide here, what we're doing is we've got this comparison of harvest sites versus reference sites, and these are in this stratification. We have both young and old harvest sites, and both young and burns, and forests that had arisen from older burns. So we're comparing natural versus harvest origin. And again, as I explained earlier, why it was important, to have this reference condition, because what we find here is that for many sites, the difference between and this is alder flycatcher, here we have black and white warbler, and in this case here, this is brown creeper. This guy right down here, which uses old snags and woody debris. And over here, this is red-eye vireo, this guy down here. And in one case, we have, that the reference condition, that in the harvest condition, the occupancy rate is lower than in the reference condition. And so there could be something in the way that we're creating stands, or the way we did in the past, that did not retain enough residual forest and allow for the retention of snags and whatnot. So we get this difference. On the other hand, with red-eye vireo, perhaps there's something that we're doing with stand harvesting, which is encouraging the creation of hardwood, and we're getting more hardwood, and so then we end up with than we would expect under natural, and we get a higher rate of red-eye vireo occurring. So these are indicators that are telling us now that there's something that we're doing that isn't quite right about the way we're emulating natural disturbance. So in this example, this is different, okay? What we're doing here is we're comparing what we expect, and this is for the whole of the ecoregion. We're not comparing harvest versus reference here. What we're doing is we're comparing the values that we found in that ecoregion to the values that we would expect under the simulation of natural variation. And for many of the species, we're quite close to what we would expect. We see not much difference. There are a couple of species, however, this is bay-breasted warbler here, and this is ovenbird, where there are differences between what our expectation is and what we actually found in our field measurements. So again, that's telling us something. There may be something about the way that, in the case of well, I don't really know. I've got a couple of ideas, but they're not really strong enough here for me to express them on the phone. But it's indicating that there's something is going on that requires more investigation. And so these evaluative indicators are helping us, giving us a measure, if you will, of whether or not we are doing a good job. In some cases we are, but in other cases we see some areas of concern. And, again, I just want to emphasize that we've just begun implementing the landscape guides and the new stand and site guides. So this isn't so much talking about, what the new guides are doing, but as the way the old guides were functioning. So, there's a few kind of general conclusions, if you will, from my talk today. First of all, is the principles of natural disturbance ecology can be used to inform forest management and conservation policies to sustain ecological integrity and ecosystem services. So, I'm a strong believer in that there's much that we can learn through our studies of natural disturbance ecology that can be used to help us do a better job of developing forest management and other conservation policies. I think that fire science and simulation can be used to estimate the desired ranges of natural variability, and I think this is really important. I mean, we need to go beyond just a single instance of what we think the world should be by looking at the past 100 years. We need to incorporate strong knowledge of fire behavior and ecological succession and be able to simulate these in order to get a true and better understanding of where we should be under a more pristine kind of environment. I think the use of carefully selected wildlife species, and again, they have to be carefully selected. You could easily pick only old growth species, and you'd only be able to look at one corner of the range of variability if that's what you did. So you carefully select wildlife species, and these can be used to assess the effectiveness of emulation of natural disturbance-based policies. testing these policies as hypotheses. This is not an exercise of trying to validate or verify the policy. It's an exercise of actually trying to test it as a scientific hypothesis. So I think that I think all of our conservation policy hypotheses, whether they be emulation of natural disturbance or other, should be, they should be treated as hypotheses, these policies. And I think that part of the social license, if you will, of taking the step of changing the way that we do things requires the use of adaptive management and some sort of method of testing whether or not this policy is actually working. And this can be used, to improve policy direction and to make kind of, fine adjustments that you need to as you go down the road, to get closer to where you want to be. So, I think I had, I'm not going to leave that one up, but in the PDF there's a few references for some of the things that I talked about here. And if anyone's interested, they can probably get a hold of that and take a look at some of those. So I think I'll leave it at this point and leave some minutes open for questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Rob. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. I can see some typing going on. I guess we'll wait and see what questions we have. Rob, one thing that came to mind is, how long was the guide under development, and how long was the approval process?
Oh my goodness. Okay, there's two kind of components of this, and it's at over 10 years of development, well over 10 years. The guides, very similar guides for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region, were approved about 4 years ago. It was an additional 4 years for approval in the Boreal, and that's because caribou was a big issue, and there needed to be support from NGOs that these guides would be appropriate for caribou as well. One of the things that I guess I didn't talk about too much is that these guides replaced a lot of previous existing guides that were specific for specific featured species. And so it's a combination of a kind of a coarse filter, if you will, of providing direction, for the overall pattern of the landscape. And then the stand and site guides have more specific for featured species. But caribou is one of those that really responds to this sort of coarse pattern across the landscape. And that took, that was a political thing. And it added, I would say, probably 3 or 4 years to the approval process. Okay. And of course, we had a big period of scientific activity in developing the simulators, developing the habitat models, and all that. So, probably, maybe if you took the whole development into case, it's probably closer 13 years or 14 years.
So, yeah, so a long time, but it takes it. I mean, there's some pretty interesting things that came out of this.
Yeah, and you have to remember, too, that a lot of this was right at the early stages of emulation and natural disturbance as a concept. And so people that are, working towards that kind of stuff now would be much further ahead than where we were back in, in the early 2000s.
Sure. We do have a question from Greg. His question is, forests are often viewed as providing outputs that are bimodal for timber products or wildlife. And you said your approach seems much more holistic. How is it being received by others in the various camps or silos?
Okay, so this is partly why I started with the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, because it really doesn't matter how it's perceived by the other camps. This is required by law. So, and that came, that law, the Crown Forest Sustainability Act came through the development of both NGOs and the forest industry. So, that whole sort of policy framework, if you will, what allowed us to move forward on this. If we were out trying to convince people that emulation and natural disturbance was a good thing, I think that would be difficult. Now, the other thing I want to say is that I've worked in provinces like Manitoba, for example, Louisiana Pacific Limited, and the manager there, that the harvest of timber, he viewed it as the surplus to ecological sustainability. So you sustain, your environment, you sustain your ecosystem first, and there's some surplus to that. So it wasn't as if, okay, you harvest the forest, and then you would left, you get to sustain. He was taking an opposite perspective, which was, I thought, very enlightened. So I'm hopeful, anyways, that forest industry and others, begin to see this. We also have the our version of the Endangered Species Act in Canada, which also requires us to maintain. So there's a number of both the policy and legislative framework for this, really sort of encourages this kind of situation, and I think that would be true in the States as well.
Yeah, it certainly nice to have the law backing it and kind of that progressive thinking of timber kind of being sustainable as kind of the extra to it.
Yeah, I think, we need to think of that too in terms of wildlife. For example, there's a certain amount of, if you think of wolf and moose and predator-prey dynamics and whatnot, there's a certain kind of natural thing that goes on in the environment that we need to maintain, and then there's a certain amount of surplus from that we can harvest as, either as moose or as fish or whatever. So I think we all need to sort of think of ecological integrity and the health of ecosystems as being a primary objective, and then once we've achieved that or are on our way to achieving that, then we can sort of harvest the surplus from that.
Yes. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. I do have kind of a follow-up because, again, this guide is specific for Ontario, and you also mentioned the Great Lakes St. Lawrence one.
Right.
Are there similar guides for the other provinces?
No. This is quite different, I think, for Ontario.
Okay.
I mean, in Canada, Quebec will have some things. And I guess maybe I said that too emphatically when I said no. But I think there are elements of this of these guides which I think are relatively unique to Ontario, but there are principles that are incorporated in with other provinces.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I guess we'll watch this as I'm kind of wrapping up to see if there's any last-minute ones. But I'll kind of wrap this up here. I'd like to thank you, Rob, for doing this, and thank everyone online for joining us this afternoon for a really good webinar and discussion. If you'd like to review the webinar or share with someone that might be interested but have missed it, a recording of the webinar will be available on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium website. We'll have that up either later today or by tomorrow. Rob, you also had sent kind of the updated PDF of the guide, and I'll make sure that link is available on the website. Did you want to say anything about that, or?
No, other than that it's, just sort of hot off the press, and there are, in total, 4 new guides. There's the Boreal one, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence one for landscapes, and then there's, there's 3. And then there's a complementary stand and site guide, which deals with, the kind of the residual structure and the things internal to the stand. So the landscape guide deals with these broader patterns, and the stand and site guide deals with more specific direction on the ground.
Okay. I'll make sure I get those links to the additional the stand guides from you, and then I can get those up on the Lake States website so that they're available for anybody to review.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for listening. I know sometimes it can be a bit hard on these webinars, when you're not there making eye contact and whatnot. So I appreciate people staying on the line and listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yes, and thank you, Rob. One last thing I just want to point out, this is concluding this year's webinar series. We're going to be starting our 2014-2015 webinar series on October 16th, 2014. If we have any special webinars that pop up this summer, we'll make sure we post these to the website, and we'll send out an email to members. Again, I want to thank you, Rob, and everyone for participating today. There should be a short survey that will pop up, and I'm going to be shutting down the recording and audio, and please stay and watch.